of the structure plans.
Through you, Mr Chair, the sequencing laid out in the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy gives an indication of the rollout of structure planning. So we've always said that structure planning ideally will occur around 3 years before the area is ready to go, with live zoning and the infrastructure in place. So that effectively gives an indication of the programming for structure planning.
Could I just have a supplementary for that, Mr Chairman, which does relate to that? Yes, my big concern is we absolutely know we have strategies, and then we have someone with a private plan change, push, 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 and then all of a sudden our strategic arm and then our consenting arm doesn't kind of match. So I suppose I want to know, are we actually matching those up? Because we've had some really poor outcomes in some parts of Westgate where we said, no, this is the plan, it's to go here, and then someone says, I want to do something over here, and our staff say, well, we can't say no, we have to let them apply. And I get really concerned about stuff being in the wrong places, people doing stuff that we never envisaged and never planned for, and then the kind of unintended consequences and what we have to deal with because of that. So how do we get around that where we've got a whole bunch of people that go, no, I want to do this somewhere, and they push? How do we,
Amanda, have you got
have we got any power in that regard?
full answer on that one, Amanda?
So what I'm saying is, and something will go ahead and there's been no structure plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, through you, Mr Chair, the private plan change process has to take its course, but the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy is there as a guide as to what Council's priorities are. So that's its purpose in life, I guess.
Thank you.
And I suppose it's worth recognising one of the key principles of the Future Urban Land Supply Strategy when it was developed was the idea that structure planning would be linked quite closely to when things would be market ready. We didn't want to have situations where you structure plan many years before it's market ready and the work that's done is not relevant to the situation at hand.
And if there's an example of how nimble we can be and have exhibited in terms of structure planning, it's the structure plan for Whanuapai, which Councillors Hulse and Cooper recently knocked off, if I can, as bluntly, in a very quick time, and again a very inclusive process. So I think we're changing the way we do our business to respond as well. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Amanda and David, thank you. I've got a couple of process questions. So first around the public engagement, because this is basically a refresh, you said in essence most of the stakeholders or affected parties are already known. My question to you is, because we're doing annual plan consultation in March before yours starts, is there any material you could potentially have at those meetings just to flag to people it's coming up at the end of this process?
Yeah. Yes, we could put together a package of information that would be useful for those meetings.
It just maybe could, tidy up any stragglers if they're coming for one thing, going on to the other. But my next one is around the panel. So you've got in the paper that you considered whether the deliberations panel should be governing body or local board, and you've determined that potentially not local board. And I just wondered why you've done that as opposed to potentially having an equal number of local board members and governing body members, bearing in mind there's only 6 local boards affected anyway, and a panel of 12 is hardly huge.
I suppose our thinking, or through the chair, our thinking of that was a couple of assumptions that we made, and I suppose that is the reason that we in the end ask for delegated authority to chair to expand it if our assumptions perhaps weren't right. The first thing was we looked at the deliberations panel last time, which we thought worked well. One of the reasons for that was a smaller panel seemed to go quite well. So with increased size, it brings its own sort of challenges. The first thing, this is a regional strategy which needs to be addressed by the regional committee and meet trade-offs across the region. So our thinking was having regional councillors on that deliberations panel was important. The third thing is that during consultation there is opportunities for local boards to make submissions and be involved in that as well. So we thought, looking at last time where we looked at that feedback, that worked well. So that were the assumptions. However, we did, I suppose, say, you know, there's the opportunity to add to that if those assumptions weren't right.
So supplementary, if I may. So I get your assumption, but I suppose my question is, in the shared governance model, is that assumption a fair assumption?
Well, ultimately, I suppose that's a decision for the committee to make, but that's our recommendation.
And if you end up by asking the chair and the deputy to have a discretion to invite everybody else, you might as well just start with the team in the beginning.
We'll come to that recommendation C when I move it shortly, and we'll address that issue. Thanks, Councillor Simpson. Mayor Goff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for the report, very full report. I'm just looking at the bottom line, and the cost you've got set out on page 38 of bulk infrastructure over the next decade from 2018 is $6.7 billion. Can you tell us how up to date that costing is? Is that something that we can rely on? Does that take into account the growth that we've received in the last couple of years as against the period before that, when it was only at a third the rate? And can you tell us what you think the estimated shortfall is in terms of meeting that infrastructure cost, in terms of the funding that we've got set aside for that development?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The figures that are in the report are up to date, so they're an update of the figures that we had previously in the current future urban land supply strategy, which was around 17 billion. So yes, they have gone up. They take into account recent technical work that's been undertaken, as I mentioned before, the supporting growth work which looks at all the transport in the greenfield areas. So it's a significant cost in these areas. In terms of shortfall, my understanding is that much of this growth is not budgeted for. Maybe 10% or so is budgeted for, but largely the bulk of the funding is not budgeted.
So that 90% of the 6.7 billion that we need in the next decade is not currently budgeted for. Is there an overlap between this and the projected figure for the Auckland Transport Alignment Project, where it's talking about a 4 billion deficit over the next 10 years? Are we double counting to add those together?
My understanding is, through the Chair, the Auckland Transport Alignment Project did pick up a number of these projects. However, we would have to go back and work out how much of, I suppose, to reconcile those. So I couldn't give you a figure off the top of my head.
Okay.
Certainly some. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. I just make the observation when I read the key considerations across a number of the areas, and I'm looking particularly at the north, but also the northwest and the like. There's an absence of environmental considerations, especially around flooding, sedimentation, where you've got very sensitive coastal environments like Okura, projects like the Northwest Wild Link that impacts on the north, loss of leach soils, and I could go on. Is there a reason why we're not putting in any environmental considerations and just focusing around infrastructure? Because in some instances the flooding concerns are severe in
Amanda, do you want to
various
just
areas.
briefly explain the role of others in contributing to this document?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I guess firstly, environmental considerations were taken into account when the future urban areas were first identified through the rural urban boundary identification process. Areas that were environmentally sensitive or subject to significant flooding were eliminated or avoided from these areas. Also, the professional input has been provided from other parts of council through the ongoing refinement process of these areas, And it is also expected that through the structure planning process, environmental issues will be addressed.
Through you, Mr Chair, I understand the answer, but it doesn't escape the fact that in a number of areas there are significant environmental constraints and concerns that we appear to be just running roughshod over. That's my perspective. The other issue I've got just goes to that around costs, and I'm looking on page 38, particularly around the budgeting that we're looking at for parks and community. And without doing too much analysis, my projection would be that what we're going to have going forward is an Auckland that is nothing like what we're used to in terms of the provision of open space. Those figures are just grossly inadequate, and that goes to the contributions regime that we're going forward. I repeat, it will be nothing like the Auckland that we're used to. You'll have phenomenal intensity and hardly any park space.
Thank you. And Councillor Hills, Councillor Watson, and then Councillor Cloak.
Yeah, through you, Chair. Thank you. I guess, you know, for me, it doesn't take a genius to see the problems we already have in Auckland, especially with the current